Let's move to another issue here, which is, well, we've touched on this many, many times. The controversial NHS clinic that led the way in prescribing puberty blockers to children who question their gender is now being closed down. The Gender Identity Development Service at Tavistock and Portman NHS Trust will close next spring after a review found that it was not safe or viable for a long-term option. The clinic in North London has been accused of rushing teenagers into life-altering treatment on hormone-blocking drugs. Legal experts said the trust could now be sued by patients who felt they did not receive the right treatment. Let's speak to Malcolm Clark, who's head of research at the LGB Alliance. Malcolm, good afternoon to you.
Hi there, Ian.
Nice to have you with us. I know your organisation, we've spoken to many people, as you know, from your organisation over the years, have always had a big question mark over this clinic.
Yes. Since we founded, I suppose one of the things that we've campaigned against is what we consider the edifice of so-called trans healthcare, which has been built up in the NHS and globally, of which the Tavistock was a major feature. We think it's based on scant evidence. It's based on misapprehensions. It's based on campaigns by social justice warriors who've pushed for the overprescribing of these dangerous tablets, the puberty blockers. We're delighted that the government has begun to realize, the NHS has begun to realize that there's a problem here. Yeah. We think that we shouldn't just stop at the Tavistock. There should be a complete overhaul of trans healthcare in this country so that it serves the interests both of young trans people, but young people in general, which we don't think it's doing at the moment.
Well, on that point, you guys know all about this because you've seen the tweets, you've seen the anger, and there's huge division between organisations. Many trans people, campaigners in particular, fire off allegations at you guys at the LGB Alliance. None of this is new stuff to you, Malcolm, but you're aware that you are anti-trans. That's why you're celebrating today, because you don't like trans people, hence no T in the title.
Well, there's a different reason why we don't put T in the title. We're LGB the way all gay organisations used to be until about 2015, and then this revolution happened where you had to be either LGBT or LGBTQ. So we think of ourselves as just going back to the basics and going back to the knitting, if you like.
And there are other organisations that can represent those other groups too, I would guess.
Of course, there's loads of organisations which are trans-only organisations, so that's fine, but that's a distraction. The point is that we think there's a real problem with puberty blockers. There's never been a proper human trial into the use of puberty blockers for young gender non-conforming kids. That's a scandal in itself. The only trial that's ever been done on animals showed that there was major impairment of the cognitive function of animals who were put on puberty blockers. If you were really concerned about young trans people, which we are, or young gender non-conforming people, I think you would have taken the evidence from that animal trial and you would have looked at it and thought, there's a problem here, let's examine again the use of puberty blockers. Instead, our critics, the likes of Pink News, the likes of Owen Jones, the likes of the social justice warriors who sort of get up in arms and criticize us, they never did anything about the evidence from the animal trials. They've never allowed a free and open and respectful debate about trans healthcare or the use of puberty blockers. They've tried to close it all down. I think, if anything, if there's any organisation that can be said to have cared about young gender non-conforming, or some of them might be trans as well, kids, it's us, because we're asking for the evidence to be examined really carefully.
It would be fair to say that Tavistock was, of course, the most well-known and has often been discussed for a variety of reasons, but it certainly isn't the only clinic.
No, but it's the biggest, it's the pioneer. It's the clinic which really championed the use of puberty blockers. It's the one that is the leading, it sets the standards, what it thinks of as standards for the whole country across the UK. So it's a major change. It's interesting in that way that so many of the LGBT organizations try to do. They're trying to spin They're saying, oh, it's fine. This one clinic is closing, and Hilary Cass, whose review has led to this decision, has suggested that we'll have other clinics across the country. But I really think this is ridiculous, because this is, as far as I can see in all the research I've done today, this is the very first time that the NHS has ever closed a clinic. I reported for the BBC. I'm a science journalist, and I've reported in the past about medical scandals. There was a big scandal in Bristol where kids had, really bad really bad surgical outcomes, and that clinic wasn't closed. Loads of kids died. That clinic was just taken, and they reformed it, and they sacked people, and people were dragged through the coals, but it stayed open. It's the same with the maternity clinics where there are scandals. This clinic has been closed as a danger to kids. Yeah. And this is based on the interim findings of Hilary Cass. It's not even gone to Parliament. It's not being debated. It's clearly such a danger that it has to, the closure has to be announced as soon as possible. And I think that should be seen as a shocking outcome.
Sure. Do you sense, because I'm royally confused about this whole trans area, Malcolm, and I'll tell you why, and I think you'll probably understand and perhaps even agree with this. This area was never hugely controversial, in the sense that you could argue, changing gender or reverting to a gender you believe you were born with is perhaps medically controversial, but trans people have lived and been around our country forever. I was reminded recently, actually, it was only a few years ago, that a trans woman won Big Brother, if you remember that. Nadia. I think. Indeed. Nadia, yeah. No, nobody even...
I voted for her.
There you go, you see. Nobody even thought about it. It's like, oh, yeah, Nadia. Yeah, but years ago, she wasn't Nadia, and the rest, everybody knows. Yeah. Nobody considered this. It seems to have become an issue when it got into the wider spectrum of gender. That seems to be, to me, you can select your gender, you can self-ID, and we don't care if you're 6 years old, you can do it then as well. Use your pronoun, all of this stuff. Would that be reasonable? Is the issue here, yes, or the controversy that's around it, began not because of trans people, but because of the wider gender movement?
I think the problem was that organisations like Stonewall ran out of things to do.
Correct.
Gay organisations, they ran out of things to do. They had to have a cause, partly to raise money, partly to keep their profile. They, for often good reasons, they fastened on trans rights. But the problem was they didn't ask, it was not like trans people were asked for their opinion. It was only this narrow group of activists who said that instead of being a vulnerable minority, which everyone agrees that trans people are, and they face discrimination and problems and all the rest of it, these organizations turned them into some sort of bullying troop that went around saying you had to use the pronouns, or if you don't, we'll commit suicide, or and also that we're now, you can have one of about 100 different genders, and then we tell children that we might have 100 genders, and I think that's really been the trigger point. All these other things about the bullying and everything else are important. Women's sports are important, but when you get to children, and some of these children have mental health issues, not all, but some. Many of them are same-sex attracted, but they don't quite realize it, and they're just finding out who they are. And then you put them into clinics and you fast-track them onto puberty blockers. I think that's where the public has decided that's a step too far.
Somebody here just texted in, Cherry, who says, I'm losing the plot. Or was the Tavistock story initially reported by you yesterday? I'm sure the first report of the story was that it was closing because they are building a bigger, better facility next year. Have you heard this, Malcolm? Or is that just a...
No, the plan is to decentralise it, to close this particular clinic, which, as I say, has championed a very particular approach. And the interim review by Hilary Cass has suggested that it's decentralised into a number of clinics across the country, smaller. But the important thing is that her report says that there was not enough attention paid to mental health at the Tavistock, and that will now be the big focus of all these different clinics. She said specifically, using the word holistic, that the care will now be holistic, so that there is a chance that puberty blockers may be given to some kids. I don't know.
Yeah.
It'll be done, she says, on much better, more robust evidence. They will, unlike the Tavistock didn't keep any proper records, so nobody knew what the outcomes were. That's another thing that she suggested will happen. But above all, they're going to address any existing mental health issues that these kids have. And we know that a lot of them do have mental health issues. So yes, of course, some people a lot of the news coverage has been a little uncertain as to how to play this, but I really do think it's a major blow to the standard model, if you like, of so-called trans healthcare.
Malcolm, great to have you on. Thank you. Appreciate your time. Malcolm Clark, who's head of research at the LGB Alliance, and certainly, man alive, they're another group that have really got it. Some trans activists, some that I know, are very, very upset with the LGB Alliance. They have a very different view on their position and their reason and their kind of motivation and what they do. But there's his take on it. It's a force for good that this clinic is closing, and anything that does reopen in any form will be a much more, I don't want to say thorough in the sense that previous areas of clinical excellence in that world and others were not thorough, but I think his point is that they need to have a different check and balance on the system, and that's what he hopes any new centre will dwell on. I hope I'm not misrepresenting his view. 0344 499 1000. That is where you'll find us. More coming up on Talk TV Live from the Talk Radio studios next.